Aloha Ohana, welcome to another episode of Freaky Friday, which is basically a mini series where I cover true crime cases that have happened on Halloween. Before we jump into today's case, please remember that this video is intended to raise awareness and this channel is intended for viewers 18 years old and older. Alright guys, today we are going to be talking and discussing the Toolbox Killers, which, you know, naming these criminals is kind of sick, but that's what they're called, Toolbox Killers. I'm not the first person to cover this story. Other creators have covered this story, but one of the crimes that these two guys have committed did occur on Halloween. Not all the murders, I think just the last one, but we are going to talk about all the other victims that these two guys tortured. And I am finding my source off of Wikipedia, so if you're listening to this video and you think, wow, that sounds exactly like Wikipedia. Yes, because that's exactly where I got the information. Alright guys, let's just start from the very beginning. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born on September 27, 1940 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Because Lawrence's parents didn't plan on having any children and didn't want to have any kids, Lawrence was placed in an orphanage by his biological mother. Lawrence would be adopted by a couple by the name of Mr. and Mrs. George Bittaker. Now, because Lawrence's adoptive father worked in the aviation industry, the family traveled and moved around a lot during Lawrence's childhood. At the ripe age of 12 years old, Lawrence began getting trouble with the law. He was arrested for shoplifting, and then over the next 4 years of Lawrence's life, he really developed a minor criminal record. He would get arrested for shoplifting and, petty minor theft. Lawrence would later say that he acted out as a teen to compensate for the lack of love he received as a child. He has an IQ of 138. That is like super smart. But Lawrence found school to be very tedious and boring. So in 1957, he dropped out of high school. Now at the time, the Bittakers were living in California. And within a year of dropping out of high school, Lawrence would get into all kinds of trouble. He would get into all kinds of nonsense. He was arrested for car theft, a hit and run, and evading an arrest. For these crimes, he was hauled off to the California Youth Authority, where he stayed there until he was an adult. When Lawrence turned 18 years old, he was released from the California Youth Authority. So after Lawrence was released, naturally, he went to go look for his adoptive parents. But by this time, the parents had moved out of state and had disowned Lawrence. Lawrence would never speak to his parents ever again. Well, let's shift our attention to Roy Norris. Roy Lewis Norris was born on February 5th, 1948 in Greeley, Colorado. Roy's parents weren't married at the time that he was born, and so to avoid the public stigma, Roy's parents would marry just for the sake of saving face. Roy's dad worked in a scrapyard, and his mother was a drug-addicted housewife. As a child and a teen, Roy would occasionally live with his parents, but he was often placed in foster care families. Roy said that his childhood sucked. Basically, his biological parents would accuse him of doing stuff that he didn't do. And being in foster care was no different. Roy said that a lot of the foster care families he lived with would neglect him, often denying him food and proper clothing. Roy also claims that he was sexually abused when he stayed within his Hispanic foster family. And Roy said that this is where his hatred towards all Hispanic people stemmed from, because when he was a foster care child, he was being sexually abused. When Roy was 16 years old, he was living with his biological parents, and he and his father went over to a female cousin's house to visit. While Roy was at his cousin's house, he began to speak to his female cousin in a very sexual, suggestive manner. And his cousin ended up telling his father. And of course, Roy's father was extremely upset. Roy's father told him that he was gonna get his butt whooped. So what Roy did is that he jumped in his father's car, stole the car, drove all the way up to the Rocky Mountains, and while he's up in the Rocky Mountains, he tries to commit suicide by injecting air into an artery. But this doesn't work and he doesn't die. So when Roy gets home, I think the police eventually apprehend him. When Roy eventually gets home, his father does give him a good beating. Also, when Roy gets home, after he gets beat up by his father, Roy's parents end up telling him that he and his sister are unwanted children and that the two of them were planning to get a divorce as soon both of the kids turned 18. A year later, after this whole incident, Roy drops out of high school and he joins the United States Army. Roy was stationed in San Diego in 1965, and in 1969, Roy was deployed to serve in the Vietnam War. Although he did not see active combat during his 4-month tour of duty. In November of 1969, Roy was arrested for his very first known sexual offense. He was charged with both rape and assault, and also with an intent to commit rape. So what had happened was Roy tried to force himself into a woman's car. 3 months later, after this incident, in February of 1970, Roy tried to force his way into a woman's home. After the woman refused to let Roy into her home, the woman was luckily able to call police and Roy was arrested. Less than 3 months after this last offense committed by Roy, Roy was seen and diagnosed by military psychologists who said that Roy had severe schizo personality. And this is why Roy was discharged. He was actually given an honorable discharge because of his psychological problems. While this is going on in Roy's life, Lawrence is also continuing to get in trouble. As soon as he's released from the California Youth Authority, Lawrence gets arrested for trying to bring a stolen vehicle across state lines. In August of 1959, Lawrence is sent to 18 months in prison at the Oklahoma State Reformatory. I always have trouble saying that word, reformatory. He was later transferred to the Medical Center for Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, and this is where he would carry out the rest of his sentence. In 1960, Lawrence was released from prison, and soon after, he started committing crime again. Within months of being released, he is arrested in Los Angeles for robbery, and in May of 1961, he is sentenced to 15 years in prison. I mean, really quick, I gotta say that this guy, Lawrence, is, for a smart guy, he's an idiot because he's committing all these crimes and he's always getting caught. He's always getting arrested. So it's like, and he keeps doing it. Like, he doesn't learn. So while Lawrence is spending this 15 years in prison, he is diagnosed by a psychiatrist as being highly manipulative. The psychiatrist also describes Lawrence as having concealed considerable hostility. Lawrence is released for parole in 1963 after completing just 2 years of his sentence. I mean, they keep letting this guy out. In October of 1964, Lawrence is sent back to prison for violating his parole. In 1966, Lawrence undergoes further examinations by 2 independent psychiatrists. Both of them classify Lawrence as borderline psychopath, having a highly manipulative individual unable to acknowledge the consequences of his actions. Basically, he sounds like a narcissist. Lawrence explained to one of these psychiatrists that committing these crimes gave him a sense of self-importance. And Lawrence also insists that circumstantial matters pertaining to his environment and also the upbringing he experienced as a child makes him less, like, he's unable to control his desire to commit these crimes. After these diagnoses, Lawrence is prescribed antipsychotic medication. About a year later, Lawrence is again released back into the world. Now, a month after he was released, in July of 1967, Lawrence is again arrested and convicted of theft and for leaving the scene of an accident. Lawrence is sentenced to 5 years in prison, again, sentenced to prison. He was released in April of 1970, so like not even the full 5-year term. I think he served like almost 3 years or something like that. But again, they release him once again back into the world. In March of 1971, Lawrence is arrested again for burglary. I mean, oh my gosh, this guy and these people keep letting him back into society to commit more crimes. So because there were reports of Lawrence repeatedly violating his parole violations, I mean, this guy's always getting into trouble, he was sentenced to serve between 6 months and 15 years back in prison in October of 1971. However, just 3 years later, Lawrence is once again released from prison. In 1974, Lawrence is arrested for assault with attempt to commit murder after he stabbed a supermarket employee who accused Lawrence of stealing. Basically, Lawrence and this employee, got into a disagreement. The employee accused Lawrence of stealing a steak, followed Lawrence outside of the store and asked him if he forgot to pay. Lawrence got upset, ended up stabbing the man in the chest. Lawrence tried to run away, but 2 other employees were able to hold Lawrence down until the police came, and so he was arrested. Lawrence would eventually be convicted of a lesser charge, which is, I think, assault with a deadly weapon. And Lawrence is sent to the California Men's Colony, which is in San Luis Obispo. Now we're going to jump back to Roy Norris really quick before I talk about how the two of them met. So Roy Norris, he's getting to his own set of troubles. Now in May 1970, Roy had attacked a female student, like walking around the campus at San Diego State University. Roy repeatedly hit this young girl on the back of her head with a rock until she slumped down, and then he began to beat her head against the sidewalk. Roy is charged with assault with a deadly weapon. Roy is sentenced to 5 years at the Atacacero. I'm so bad with names. Anyways, he's sentenced to some state hospital because, yeah, he's mental, where he's classified as a mentally disordered sex offender. Roy is released from this hospital in 1975. He's given 5 years probation, and the doctors actually classify him as, quote, no further danger to others, end quote. Boy, were they wrong. Just 3 months after Roy is released from the hospital, he approaches a 27-year-old young woman who's walking at Redondo Beach, and he offers her a ride on his motorcycle. Now, when the woman refuses a ride, this really pisses Roy off. So he pulls his motorcycle over on the side, parks his motorcycle, gets off his motorcycle, grabs the girl, now she was wearing a scarf at the time, grabs the woman's scarf around her and starts to twist it around her neck before he informs her that he is going to rape her. And he drags her into the bushes nearby. Now, this woman, of course, is deadly afraid, so she doesn't scream. And she does not resist the rape. That is how afraid this woman is. After this woman is done being raped, she reports it to the police, but they're unable to find who the perpetrator was. About a month later, the woman is walking and she spots Roy's motorcycle. So she takes down the motorcycle license plate number. She calls the police and she gives the police the information. And the police go and arrest Roy for the rape. About 1 year later, Roy is tried and convicted for the rape of this young woman, and he is sentenced to California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. Now, at California Men's Colony, this is where Roy and Lawrence would meet. Lawrence and Roy met in 1977 in the California Men's Colony, basically 1 year after Roy arrived at the prison. The two men gradually became closer and closer when Roy taught Lawrence how to make jewelry. According to Roy,
Lawrence saved him from being attacked by several inmates on at least 2 different occasions. By 1978, the 2 men became very close, and this is around the time when both men realized that they had an appetite and interest in sexual violence. And Norris claimed that his biggest turn-on was when he would see these young women being very, very frightened. And this is basically the reason why Roy has an extensive history of crimes involving sexual offenses, because according to Roy, that was his biggest turn on, is that when he's assaulting these women and he sees the fear in their face and in their eyes, he gets more turned on by this. Now, according to Lawrence, he tells Roy that if he was ever to rape a woman, because now that wasn't Lawrence's MO. His was, robbery, theft, stealing cars. Lawrence told Roy that if he ever had raped a woman, that he would kill her because he didn't want to leave behind any sort of evidence. In prison, this is where the 2 men would discuss their plan that when they would get out of prison, it would be neat to rape a woman in all ages. So from the age of 13 years old all the way through 19. The 2 men declared that once they were both released, they would get in touch with one another to carry out this plan. Lawrence is released from prison on October 15, 1978. He returns back to Los Angeles and he finds work as a skilled machinist. Lawrence is making good money. He's earning about $1,000 a week. Now, back in 1978, that was, really good money. I mean, it's still good money today, 2021. So can you imagine back in 1978? And a lot of people in the neighborhood thought Lawrence was very friendly. I mean, he was a loner and quiet and he kept to himself, but people liked him. A lot of people said that he was generous, he helped a lot of people. He would donate money to the Salvation Army. On one occasion, he's known to buy a bunch of food from a fast food restaurant and then serve the homeless in downtown Los Angeles. A lot of the local teenagers knew Lawrence and liked to hang around him because they knew he always had beer and marijuana in his motel room, and a lot of the local teenagers would go to Lawrence's place to smoke weed, drink beer, and to socialize. Now, Roy is released from prison on January 15, 1979, and Roy moves into his mother's home in Redondo Beach. Within 1 month of being released, Roy ends up raping a woman and then leaving her alone in the desert. Roy was working as an electrician in Compton. Shortly after Roy's release, he receives a letter from Lawrence. In late February, Lawrence and Roy, they meet up in a hotel and they start talking about their fantasy plan that they had discussed earlier while they were in prison. Now, in order to carry out this plan, Lawrence said that it was a good idea that they get a van versus a car. So they put their money together and they ended up purchasing a 1977 GMC Vandura van, which is basically one of those big, creepy raper vans. Basically those vans that have like no window on one side and then the other side is just this big, large sliding door. Yeah, those creeper vans. And the sick duo actually named this van Murder Mac. Now, the 2 men, they didn't just go out and start raping and murdering women, and they actually practiced picking up different women. February to June of 1979, the men picked up about 20 different female passengers. And the men didn't assault not one of those women. What they wanted to do was to basically practice how they would approach a woman and how they would get the woman to hopefully voluntarily join them in the van. Their plan was also to go to different secluded areas because they wanted to find, the perfect spot that they would bring these teenage girls up to. Eventually, in late April, Lawrence and Roy, they do find an isolated fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains. Lawrence breaks the lock gate with a crowbar, and he puts on his own personal lock on this gate. Roy and Lawrence end up killing their first victim on June 24th, 1979. The two guys had just finished constructing a bed that they had put in the back of the van, like towards the end of the van. And under this bed, they placed tools, clothes, and they had a cooler that was filled with beer and soft drinks. 16-year-old Lucinda Lyn Schaefer was leaving a church meeting in Redondo Beach. At approximately 7:46, Roy notices Lucinda walking down a side street, and he turns to Lawrence and he says, quote, "There's a cute little blonde," end quote. Roy and Lawrence approach Lucinda and they offer her a lift home and some marijuana. But Lucinda turns the two men down. So Roy and Lawrence, they drove past Lucinda further ahead of her and they park alongside a driveway. Roy comes out of the van and he goes to the other side of the van, the side with the large sliding door. So he's there, he opens the sliding door and he's pretending that he's looking for something in the van. But meanwhile, his peripheral vision, he's actually watching Lucinda walk closer and closer towards the van. Before he drags Lucinda into the van, he exchanges a few words with her. He drags her into the van and he shuts the van door. Lawrence turned up the radio volume on full blast so that nobody could hear what they were doing and nobody could hear her scream. Meanwhile, Roy is tying up Lucinda's arms and her legs and gags Lucinda with duct tape as they drive towards that fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains. The two men get to this fire road. It's very secluded, nobody's around, and they end up taking turns assaulting Lucinda. Lucinda asked them if she could pray before they killed her. Unfortunately, the two men denied her request. Allegedly, Roy is the one who first attempted to strangle Lucinda. But after about 45 seconds, he became very disturbed at the look in her eyes and so runs to the front of the van and begins to vomit. Lawrence then manually strangled Lucinda until she fell to the ground and started to convulse. He grabbed a wire coat hanger and twisted it around her neck until she stopped convulsing. After the men had murdered Lucinda, they wrapped her body in a plastic shower curtain and threw her over a steep canyon that Lawrence had selected. According to Roy, Lawrence assured him that the animals would eat her up, so there wouldn't be any evidence left. 2 weeks after the men murdered Lucinda, on July 8, 1979, they end up picking up an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Andrea Joy Hall along the Pacific Coast Highway. At first, as the two men slowed the van down as they were approaching Andrea and asked her for a ride, another vehicle actually beat them to it, and Andrea ended up getting into the first car that had stopped to pick her up. But you would think that this would deter the men from their mission, but this didn't deter them at all. They followed the vehicle that Andrea was in and watched her until the vehicle stopped and Andrea was let out. For some reason, on this occasion, Roy hid in the back of the van to make it seem like Lawrence was the only person in the van. In the van, Lawrence offered Andrea a cold drink. And when Andrea went to go grab the drink, this is when Roy pounced on Andrea. After a strenuous fight between Roy and Andrea, Roy is able to subdue her by twisting her arm behind her back, which caused Andrea to scream out in pain. Roy then gagged Andrea with adhesive tape and then bound her wrist and her ankles. The two men then drove out to the San Gabriel Mountains with Andrea, but this time they would drive a little further beyond where they had taken Lucinda earlier. When they got to this location, the men would take turns assaulting Andrea, while Lawrence was assaulting Andrea for the second time. He saw what he believed to be vehicle lights approaching, so this kind of freaked the guys out. So Lawrence put his hands over Andrea's mouth while Roy drove off looking for this vehicle. When Roy couldn't find that vehicle, he went back to where Lawrence and Andrea was. He picked them up, and this time he drove further into the San Gabriel Mountains. Lawrence forced Andrea to walk uphill naked and to pose for nude pictures. For some reason, the guys decided to drive to a third location. And when they got to this third location, once again, Lawrence made Andrea walk uphill naked and take more pictures. While Lawrence is with Andrea, Roy drives off to a general store to purchase more alcohol. When Roy gets back, he notices that Lawrence is by himself. Lawrence told Roy that he had killed Andrea, but before he did, he said that he challenged her for her to give him reasons as to why she should be allowed to live, before he stabbed an ice pick through her ear into her brain, then turned Andrea's body over and stabbed the ice pick into her other ear, stomping on it until it broke. Lawrence then strangled Andrea before he threw her body off of a cliff. On September 3rd, Roy and Lawrence noticed two girls sitting on a bus stop bench near Hermosa Beach. The two girls, named Dorris Gilliam and Jacqueline Leah Lamp, were hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway before Lawrence and Roy observed them as they were resting at the bus stop. Lawrence and Roy offered the girls a ride, and they accepted. Inside the van, both of the girls were offered marijuana, and they both accepted. Shortly after getting into the van, the girls noticed that they were driving towards the San Gabriel Mountains, where the girls told Roy and Lawrence that they were going in the wrong direction and that they didn't want to go, into the San Gabriel Mountains. Basically, Roy and Lawrence came up with all these type of excuses, but the girls weren't buying it. Jacqueline Lamp, who was just 13 years old at the time, tries to go and open the sliding door, but Roy hits her on the head with a bag filled with lead weights, which briefly knocks her unconscious. Jackie Gilliam, who is 15 years old at this time, also tries to get out of the van, but Roy overpowers her. He begins to bind and gag Jackie. As he's binding and gagging Jackie, Jacqueline regains consciousness, and again she tries to escape. But Roy ends up grabbing her arm and twisting it behind her back. He then drags her back into the van. Now, as this struggle is going on, Lawrence is worried that somebody is going to hear the commotion. Pulls the van over, and he gets out. He punches Jackie in the face. Then he helps Roy finish binding and gagging the two girls. The girls were also driven into San Gabriel Mountains, where they were held captive for about 2 days. Like the victims before, these two girls were also assaulted repeatedly. The men slept in the van alongside their hostages, taking turns being the lookout. During this assault, Lawrence forced Jacqueline to take nude pornographic pictures. Lawrence also asked Roy to take pictures of himself with Jackie, both with and without clothing on. Lawrence would also tape record himself raping Jackie. And on this tape, Lawrence is forcing Jackie to pretend that she is his cousin. And he's also telling Jackie to express her pain. Like he's getting off of it, you know, he wants her to scream. Lawrence is also known to have stabbed Jackie in her breasts with an ice pick and used pliers to rip off one of her nipple. After almost 2 days being held as hostages, the two girls were then murdered. Jackie was struck in each ear with an ice pick and then strangled to death. Lawrence forced Jacqueline out of the van and he struck her on her head with a sledgehammer. Lawrence then strangled Jacqueline until he thought she had died. But when Jacqueline opened her eyes, Roy again bludgeoned her repeatedly as Lawrence strangled her to death. The girls' bodies were thrown over an embankment into the chaparral. Roy and Lawrence's final victim was murdered on October 31st, 1979. 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford was abducted while she was standing outside of a gas station, hitchhiking home from a Halloween party. Investigators believe Shirley accepted a ride from the two men because she recognized Lawrence as someone who frequented the restaurant that Shirley used to waitress at. After Shirley went into the van, Roy offered her some marijuana, but she refused. Lawrence drove the van down to a secluded street where Roy pulled out a knife. Then he bound and gagged Shirley with construction tape. Lawrence and Roy traded places, and while Roy was driving around pretty much aimlessly for about an hour, Lawrence is in the back of the van tormenting Shirley. He's slapping her, he's mocking her, he's beating her with his fists, he's screaming at her, he's shouting at her. Shirley, of course, she begins to cry and plead with Lawrence. And in response to this, Lawrence orders her to scream louder. Then he starts to beat her with a hammer and he starts to beat up on her breasts and torture her with pliers. He's also assaulting her, he's sodomizing her. Again, for some reason, Lawrence got a kick off of tape recording this. The tape recording, you can actually hear Shirley pleading, you can hear her screaming, you can hear her crying. Torture and abuse Shirley endured got so bad that Shirley pleaded, "If you stop hitting me, then I'll scream louder." After about 2 hours of being in captivity by Roy and Lawrence, after being tortured and tormented, Roy kills Shirley by strangling her with a wire coat hanger. Lawrence then decides to dump Shirley's body on some random lawn in order to get a reaction from the press. So the pair drives to a random house in Sunland and discards Shirley's body. Shirley's body was found by a jogger the following morning. An autopsy revealed that in addition to having been sexually violated, Shirley died of strangulation after receiving extensive blunt force trauma to her face, head, breast, and left elbow. Her genitalia and rectum was torn, caused in part by Lawrence inserting pliers inside her body. In addition, her left hand bore a puncture wound and a finger on her right hand had been slashed. November of 1979, Roy ends up connecting with an old friend of his by the name of Joseph Jackson. Two men were incarcerated together at the California Men's Colony. Now, like an idiot or like a narcissist, if you will, Roy tells Joseph everything. Roy also tells Joseph that in addition to the 5 murders that he and Lawrence had committed, there were 3 other incidents in which he and Lawrence had abducted and attempted to abduct young women who either escaped or was actually raped but then was released. Joseph, he hears these confessions and he is tripping out. I mean, his old buddy just told him that he was pretty much a serial killer. Joseph consults with his attorney and asks his attorney what he should do with this information. And of course, his attorney advises him to tell the authorities. So Joseph agrees to tell the authorities. He and his attorney call the Los Angeles Police Department. The Los Angeles Police Department tell the two men to call the Hermosa Police Department. A detective by the name of Paul Bynum is assigned to investigate these claims that Joseph is saying. He has to go figure out whether or not there's any truth to these confessions. Well, as this detective is out there trying to figure out if there's any truth to it, he comes across all these reports that were made of several teenage girls that were missing over the past 5 months. In addition to this, the detective comes across a report that was filed by a woman who said that she was sprayed with mace in her face, dragged into a GMC van, and raped by 2 men. She described the 2 men as being Caucasian and in their 30s. Detective Paul Bynum decides to go and visit this woman named Robin Robeck. And when he goes and visits Robin, he brings with him a series of mugshots. Without hesitation, Robin positively identifies Roy and Lawrence as the 2 men that had raped her on September 30th. After making this connection, Hermosa police decide to put surveillance or put eyes on Roy. Within days of watching him, they observe Roy dealing marijuana. On November 20th, 1979, Hermosa police end up arresting Roy for parole violation. On that same day, Lawrence is arrested for the rape of Robin Robeck. Crazy thing though is that although Robin was able to pick out Roy and Lawrence in those series of mugshots, she was unable to positively identify them in a police lineup. Nonetheless, police did observe Roy dealing marijuana, which is a parole violation, and Lawrence also had drugs on him. Both of the men were held on charges of parole violation. After detectives searched Lawrence's apartment, they find several photographs of Andrea Hall and Jackie Gilliam, both of these women who were reported missing earlier that same year. Inside of Lawrence's van, investigators find a sledgehammer, a plastic bag filled with lead weights, a book detailing how to locate police radio frequencies, a jar of Vaseline, 2 necklaces, which are later confirmed as belonging to 2 of the victims, and a tape recording of a young woman in obvious distress. Fortunately, Shirley Ledford's mother was able to identify the young woman on that tape recording as being her daughter Shirley. And of course, the voices on the tape recording, the 2 men mocking and torturing her, are identified as Roy and Lawrence. Inside of Roy's apartment, investigators find a bracelet that he had taken from Shirley's body. Also found at the homes of both men were Polaroid pictures of almost 500 young teenage girls. Most of these photographs were taken at Redondo Beach and Hermosa Beach. And most of these pictures were taken without the girls' knowledge or consent. On March 18, 1980, Roy pleads guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder in relation to Andrea Hall, 2 counts of rape, and 1 count of robbery. In return for Roy's agreeing to plead guilty and to testify against Lawrence, prosecutors agreed not to seek out the death penalty nor life without parole. On May 7, 1980, Roy is sentenced to 45 years to life imprisonment with eligibility for parole from 2010. On April 24, 1980, Lawrence is arraigned on 29 charges of kidnapping, rape, sodomy, and murder, in addition to various charges of criminal conspiracy and possession of a firearm. He was also charged with 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, dating from December 1979, in which he had unsuccessfully attempted to persuade 2 inmates due to be released to murder Robin Robeck in order to prevent her from testifying against him at his upcoming trial. Unfortunately, the charges for raping Robin Robeck would later be dropped because of the lack of physical evidence, as well as Robin's inability to positively identify the 2 men in a police lineup. Again, which I think is strange. Now, when Lawrence goes for his arraignment, he actually doesn't say anything. He remains quiet. So Judge William Hollingsworth actually puts in a plea for him and pleads not guilty on Lawrence's behalf. Roy would try to put the blame on Lawrence, saying that Lawrence became more violent toward their victims. Roy would agree to go out to the San Gabriel Mountains to help police and investigators search for the girls' bodies. Roy tried to bring detectives to each location where he and Lawrence disposed of the girls' bodies once they were murdered. Unfortunately, Lucinda Lyn Schaefer and Andrea Hall's bodies were never found. On February 9, 1980, the skeletalized bodies of Jacqueline Lamp and Jackie Gilliam were found at the bottom of a canyon alongside a dry riverbed. On February 17, 1981, after deliberating for 3 days, the jury finds Lawrence guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, 5 charges of kidnapping, 9 charges of rape, 2 charges of forcible oral copulation, 1 charge of sodomy, and 3 charges of unlawful possession of a firearm. Lawrence was sentenced to death for 5 counts of first-degree murder, upon which the prosecution had sought this penalty. Lawrence showed no emotion as the verdict was being read during their trials. Roy was pretty up and up about what happened and his role in the abductions and the murders. However, at Lawrence's trial, he pretty much lied. I mean, he was saying that he paid these girls to pose for the nude photographs. He said that he told Andrea Hall to find her own way home. As far as Lucinda Lyn Schaefer, Lawrence denied any knowledge in the abduction and murder of Lucinda Lyn Schaefer. And he claimed that he paid Andrea Hall to pose for those Polaroid photographs, saying that he had met her at the Burbank Motel and that Hall had agreed to take $200 for sex. He also claims that Roy walked Andrea Hall into the San Gabriel Mountains and that when Roy came back alone and that he told Hall to, quote, find her own way home, end quote. Lawrence also had a similar explanation as far as Jackie Gilliam and Jacqueline Lamp. Lawrence claimed Jackie accepted money for sex and posing for pictures, and that he had last seen the girls alone with Roy in the GMC van. In regards to the murder of Shirley Ledford, Lawrence claims Shirley agreed to theatrically scream for the tape recorder, and that she was not tortured in his presence, but had been left alone with Roy. So I guess Roy and Lawrence tried to blame each other. Roy became eligible for parole in 2009. For some reason, Roy declined to attend the parole hearing, and therefore it automatically deferred his parole eligibility for 10 years. Roy was denied parole again in 2019. Roy died while incarcerated in early 2020, I think due to medical reasons. Lawrence died while incarcerated on death row at San Quentin State Prison on December 13, 2019, at the age of 79. His death was reported as being due to natural causes. Sadly, Detective Paul Bynum, who was the chief investigator of the murders committed by Lawrence and Roy, committed suicide December of 1987. Paul was just 39 years old. In a 10-page suicide note left behind by Paul, he specifically referred to the murders by Roy and Lawrence as haunting him, and that he was afraid that they would be released from prison. A tape cassette that Roy and Lawrence created of themselves raping and torturing Shirley Ledford is still in the possession of the FBI Academy. This specific recording is now used to train and desensitize FBI agents to the raw reality of torture and murder. Wow, guys, this case was a long one. This case was bizarre. Now, I know Lawrence, before he died, while in prison, he did do, I think, 2 interviews. And I know during these interviews, he pretty much showed no remorse, and he was just basically sorry that they got caught. Alright guys, that's about it for me today. That's all I have for you on this case. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. Happy Halloween to all you trick-or-treaters, and I will see you guys next week. Bye!